Okay, thank you. So I want to make sure, if I don't let you out on time, you won't come back tomorrow. And so I want to make sure we do that. But, you know, there were a couple of things that, that we talked about today that I think are the smallest beautiful piece was great, and it was a really good theme, but I think there were a couple of others. And there were terms that floated around today that I think are worth sort of pointing out what we're trying to do with that space. One of them is research and development. And you know, when you use R&D, we started talking about this because we noticed that if we tell the students that they can participate in research, their eyes glaze over and they look like, because they all went to high school, right? And they know in high school research meant, you know, a 25-page term paper with 17 sources. And we tell them they have to do that at college. They look at us like they'd rather, you know, die. And so, but if we say R&D, that sounds cool. It sounds techy, sounds Silicon Valley. So we want to say R&D is what we do. And it is what we do. But even today, we tried to make that concept a little bigger. I think when you listen to Heather and some of the last panel, or if you read John Erickson's book, The Progress Illusion, he didn't pump that up when he was up here. His most recent book is really fantastic, highly recommended on this topic, The Progress Illusion. But if you think about research, we all do research all the time. We all look at things that don't make sense and try and figure out a way that we can reposition our brains to make them make sense. That's what we mean by research. That's what we want the students to hear when we tell them that they're going to do research. They have a chance to do research at the university. Is you're going to try and figure out how you can wrap your head around something. It's just that simple. And so I think as we start to talk about a conference like this that brings, you know, art and research and industry and problem solving and society and community together, you think, oh my God, what a tangle. Whose bright idea was that? That was me, I'm sorry to say. But you know, as we try and do some of this thing, we have the real benefit of thinking about the fact that we're all doing research on this all the time, right? Heather's farmers and Heather as she's in the field. You know, Thor, as he's trying to talk to fishermen, they're trying to wrap their head around ways that they can actually make sense of this. And when they can, they think, oh, okay, that's something that's actionable. And so when we say development, we really actually mean then taking that new mindset and trying to actually implant it on the world in some way that actually makes that difference. And so in that way, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about, you know, startups, or we're talking about art institutions, or Jay's telling us about what he's trying to do by putting a dinosaur in a crowd of people, which that image is going to stay with me for a long time. You know, I think we're all doing research and development all the time. And I think that's the real possibility that we're able to do something on some of these really messy problems together. The other term that gets thrown around a lot in these contexts that we heard a lot today is startup, and I promised I would give you the definition of that. You know, as you know, Kyle said this, trying to define a startup, and my solution is to go again back to philosophy. William James said there's 3 stages to every new idea, right? The first stage is, well, that's preposterous. The second stage of any new idea is, that is potentially true but trivial. And the third stage is, we've known that for years, right? And I think a startup is anything in stage 1 or 2. And it doesn't matter if it's a piece of art, it doesn't matter if it's a new technology, it doesn't matter if it's a community initiative. If you're passionate about something, and most of the people around you say, well, that's preposterous, you're probably a startup already. And if you get a couple people doing it together, or you're doing it about a product, then you're probably an industry startup. And if you've got an idea for how to change the town that you live in, you're probably a community initiative startup. But I think that startup mentality is something, as President Garamella put it this morning, that really is sort of intrinsic to Vermont. There's a lot of self-starters here. I said stubborn when I was talking to Kyle, and I meant it. I'm from New England, I get it. But my parents were stubborn. I'm stubborn. But I think that there's a bit of that, we could call it grit, or it's less ambition than it is, you know, stick-to-itiveness, and people who have a kind of weird Yankee determination. And that's just not the people who are from here. I'm not one of these. You have to have an island named after you to be a real Vermonter. I've lived here about 3.5 years. But you kind of, I don't know if it's in the water, maybe we'll check into that at the Hydrology Institute, but it's sort of something that happens to people when they get here. They get a little of that stick-to-itiveness. And so I think we have a lot of startups. And I think that what we're trying to do with this conference is say, that's the space where the university can really engage you. By the time we get to, well, we've known that for years, then we're actually, the university is less helpful then than anywhere, which is good. You don't need our help. But if you're at that startup stage of 1 and 2, where it's either preposterous or potentially true, but probably trivial, we're your place to be. And I think that we're going to hear more about that tomorrow with some of the things that we're helping out. We're going to hear more about the Institute for Rural Partnerships. And those are a couple places that you can attach. The third term that I just wanted to say we've sort of hit on a couple of times today in different ways. And, I think Dominic's going to talk about this quite a bit tomorrow. This is another of his terms. I've stolen several throughout the day. I think of it as prefacing a very good talk. So, is corridor. And I'm going to let him define that for himself tomorrow. But when we talk about an innovation corridor, it's irrelevant these days whether it's the same industry, right? I mean, I think that's what Torben was just saying, about Kendall Square is, it's not like the old days, right? We know this, like all of the people who sold thread got together on the same bridge in Venice because the customers knew to go there, and so if you're going to sell it, you could get the customers, and the customers would go there because that's where everyone who sold thread was, right? We don't anymore need to talk about a corridor as an industry-specific kind of endeavor. What it really is happening in Kendall Square is a cultural phenomenon, right? It's a cultural phenomenon of the kinds of things that we talked about today. It's got some aesthetic. It has a certain tempo, right? It has a like set of values. It has a fail-fast mentality. It has a lot of sort of experimentation and forgiveness. It has a lot of acceptance of preposterous ideas because you just don't know. And so I think where we start talking about the ability of Vermont to exist in a new kind of development corridor, we really have to identify what we mean by that kind of startup culture that we're talking about and where it's going to spread to. And the nice thing about doing my job is you get calls all the time saying, I can't believe I'm not on your webpage. We're running a really cool startup space in Rutland. And I say, oh, that's good. So people find me to tell me what I'm missing about what's happening in Vermont, and that's a real luxury, because I could never find everybody that I need to find. But I think if we start thinking about what's the corridor that we're going to exist in, what is that culture, how do we create that sort of, that willingness to make mistakes, that's the kind of opportunity space that I think it's going to take. Now, I could be completely wrong. Thankfully, we have Dominic Endicott to have some facts behind some of these things, and he's going to talk about that tomorrow. But I think we're on some of the same page. And I think that those opportunities are here. Hopefully, you've seen them today. So, I think that's it for day one. We have tomorrow morning, we'll start at 9 o'clock. Back here, we have some more different kinds of panels tomorrow, investor ideas. We've got some pitches from some startups and some potential startups that are happening around here. We have some great student programming. We have some interviews with some fund managers. So it's going to be a different kind of day tomorrow, just like today was hopefully a little unexpected as well. And we're really looking forward to seeing you all there. Thanks.